This is the American Law Journal.
Your vote for president could affect you for 4 years, but the Supreme Court justice that he chooses could impact your rights as a citizen for a lifetime. Good evening, I'm Christopher Naughton. This is the American Law Journal, and this week we take a look at does the future of the U.S. Supreme Court matter in this election? 4 guests weigh in. Let's go ahead and meet them. Pammela Saunders hails from Drexel University, Earle Mack School of Law. She is formerly with the U.S. State Department and the Office of the Solicitor General. Howard J. Bashman is a nationally known appellate trial attorney, writes for the Legal Intelligencer, and he hosts the popular How Appealing blog. And apparently, Justice Kagan of the Supreme Court enjoys that blog. Professor Tuan Samahon is with Villanova University School of Law in Radnor, Pennsylvania, where he is a federal courts and constitutional law professor. And Tony Mauro joins us today from the CNN studios in Washington, D.C. 30-plus years, veteran, award-winning Supreme Court reporter. You've read him in the National Law Journal, USA Today, and in the Supreme Court Insider. Throughout tonight's program, Gina Passarella, senior staff writer with the Legal Intelligencer, interviewed Jeffrey Toobin, author of The Oath, and the CNN Legal Analyst in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, just earlier this month. We will introduce clips, video clips from that discussion, and we'll parry off of those. Tony Mauro, let's start with you. The latest survey from Hart Research, I think People for the American Way and the Alliance for Justice were involved in the survey. They said that 2 out of 3 people in the United States say that Supreme Court nominations are an important factor in voting for the president. If that's the case, why does it seem that so very few people are talking about this? Let's start with the candidates.
I've been writing about this issue for 8 presidential elections. I just realized that the Supreme Court should be such an important issue in the presidential election, but it never seems to get there because I think the candidates feel that it's hard to convey to the public that's a direct line between electing president and changing the Supreme Court. It's not like the president come in on day one and fire the Supreme Court. Sure. Changing the court, it depends on who leaves, when the justice leaves, what the mood of the Senate is, who the new nominee is, and then of course not every Supreme Court justice votes the way the president wishes. So right. It's a hard case to make that it's a crucial issue. And
Howard, sometimes we know in our United States history that presidents do run against the Supreme Court. FDR did it in the 30s. Richard Nixon did it in the 1960s. Why do you think Obama's not doing it in the 2010s?
Well, I think that Obama's not doing it simply because there's not a whole lot to complain about beyond the Citizens United case. The healthcare decision, which came out, ruled in his favor, with the Chief Justice joining the majority to provide the necessary 5th vote. And I think that Obama does have a track record of what type of justices he'll be appointing with the 2 that he's already appointed. And I think that people expect that Governor Romney, if he's elected president, will appoint justices similar to the ones that George W. Bush had put on the court. Sure. In fact, I've heard a lot of criticism about Obama that he hasn't focused enough on the selection of lower court judges who end up sometimes on the Supreme Court, and appointing young liberal judges to the lower court so that he can choose from among those to stock the Supreme Court later on.
Tony Mauro, in this next term, again, depending on who is going to be elected president, they could make 1, maybe 2, maybe 3 selections. Let's face it, abortion and the right to choose hangs in the balance. We know that it's not just about Roe versus Wade. There was the Planned Parenthood case that came out of Pennsylvania, Casey, Planned Parenthood, in the early 1990s by the slimmest of margins, 5-4. We could see this shift and change. Doesn't this become the most important of political issues? And once again, I have to ask, why isn't this front and center in this presidential campaign when that is what is at stake? Well,
I think you're right that abortion does hang in the balance in this coming election. Justice Ginsburg, who is 79, the oldest justice now, if she leaves and a President Romney replaces her, then you really have 5 votes probably restrict or at least send back the issue of abortion to the states, and you would have a patchwork across the country of which states will allow abortions and which won't.
Right.
But again, I think in this the campaign so far, social issues like abortion have not played as much of a role as you might expect. They've been overshadowed by the economy and other issues. So I think that explains why it hasn't been front and center.
Interesting, because women's issues have come up at every debate so far. I'm just surprised that maybe people just don't want to use the A word in the middle of a debate. The court doesn't like to see itself as a political entity, but is it? Let's listen to Jeff Toobin, who was here in Philadelphia recently.
Here's an important fact about the Supreme Court. There are 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. I will speak for somewhat longer, but this is basically all you need to know. And it is true that the justices wear robes because they're supposed to look all alike, and they're supposed to look, it's supposed to give the perception that they're all pretty much the same. But just as on the other side of First Street, the United States Congress is deeply divided according to party, so is the United States Supreme Court. And this is a moment of real partisan division at the Supreme Court, and that is exemplified in case after case.
Tuan, is it really that simple?
I think that's a gross oversimplification. We have about 80 cases that get heard by the Supreme Court. We've got something 50 some odd that are 9-zip decisions, many more that are 8-2, 6-3. And we've got 15 this last term, I think, that were 5-4 splits, and not all those 5-4 splits were along the anticipated partisan lines, right? So we're really talking about a handful of issues.
Howard, would you agree we're in an age of ideological purity when it comes to Supreme Court nominations? Let's face it, back in the 50s, Eisenhower called William Brennan his worst mistake. JFK picked a very conservative jurist in Byron White. And of course, people probably remember that Gerald Ford picked John Paul Stevens, who turned out to be a very liberal justice in the pantheon of the court. And then no one's ever going to forget the fact that George Bush the First, because of John Sununu, picked David Souter. Those days are gone, aren't they?
Well, certainly the last 4 nominations would suggest that, but you're overlooking one name, which is Harriet Miers. And people forget her, but she was originally nominated for the seat that Justice Alito ended up filling. And she had been the chief of staff for George W. Bush, and her thoughts about judicial issues were rather unknown and undeveloped. And there was a big outcry by the conservative movement that I think ended up with her nomination being vetoed.
Only because, and Tony Mauro maybe backed me up on this, only because they thought that she wasn't qualified, not that she didn't have the ideological chops. Tony, why don't you weigh in on that?
Well, I think she did have a severely unqualified resume, but I think there also was a political element. There was some uncertainty about how conservative she really was. But I agree with Howard on that observation. But I do think that now more than in decades past, where there is more of an ideological purity and predictability in the nominees of late, and presidents are doing this very consciously because they know that who they appoint to the Supreme Court is possibly one of the biggest parts of their legacy as president. So they want to cast their shadow forward as predictably and as long as they possibly can.
Right, and a president's always going to say, I want the brightest, I want the best jurist, I want someone who's going to consider every angle, I want an open mind. Well, yeah, when JFK picked Byron White, or maybe when George Bush the First picked David Souter, but again, I don't expect we're going to see that in our lifetimes or anytime soon. I mean, it's almost as if they don't want to make a mistake. And if you take a look at, well, let's let Jeff Toobin speak to this issue. Again, he was in Philadelphia recently at the Free Library. Gina Passarella with the Legal Intelligencer got a chance to both sit down with him and also to videotape his general discussion before the audience that evening. And here's what he had to say about the ideological drift of the court.
It is the most important story in American politics. It is the most important story in the Supreme Court because moderate Republicans dominated the Supreme Court for 2 generations. And as you look at Nixon's appointments to the Supreme Court, the 1970s, a lot of people thought, oh, the court's going to move way to the right because Nixon has all these appointments. The 70s were almost as liberal as the 60s. The Republican Party of 1980 was not the Republican Party of today either, and we saw that in Reagan's nominations to the Supreme Court. And moderate Republicans are gone. They are gone at the Supreme Court. They are gone in the United States Congress.
This may be more of a question for Howard or Tony, but even law professors probably can't ignore the rightward drift that we have seen at the Supreme Court. Some would say, and maybe Howard will chime in here in a moment and say this is the revenge for what Earl Warren did in the 1950s and 60s.
So, I mean, there is definitely something to that. You do see that the politics that have changed in Congress and in general are affecting what the ideologies are of the different justices. And I think you would expect to see that because the different presidents are going to reflect their political views when they make appointments. On the other hand, I think to the question you asked earlier, I don't think it's the same type of politics on the court because it is ideologically driven when they make a decision, and that's not the same type of thing we think of necessarily when we think of a politician or politics of a congressman and what people don't like about politics. That's I think a different way in which politics works with the Supreme Court justices.
If I could interject too, I mean, Jeffrey Toobin's observation is about the Republicans, but it bears reminding that the Democratic Party of the 60s, 70s, and 80s is gone too. So that used to be a much bigger tent with Southern Democrats, whereas now there really aren't many socially conservative Democrats anymore.
And let's go back to Jeffrey Toobin real quickly because I think he buttresses this point, and Howard brought it up a moment ago. This is Jeffrey Toobin talking about the last 3 appointments to the Supreme Court.
It is worth pausing to think about the last 3 justices who left the Supreme Court. Sandra Day O'Connor, David Souter, and John Paul Stevens. 3 more different human beings you will never meet. But what did they have in common? They were all moderate Republicans. They were all moderate Republicans who left the court deeply and totally alienated from the modern Republican Party.
Well, I think that's true. We certainly have seen comments from O'Connor, to a lesser extent Souter, since they left the court, that they are pretty discouraged about the direction the court has taken, the direction the Republican Party has taken. So I think that is accurate. But again, the question is, can you always predict how a justice, a nominee is going to come out? I think we saw just last term in the Affordable Care Act, John Roberts, the Chief Justice, was a pretty pure conservative, and in these circumstances of the moment, he bolted and he went with the liberal wing and upheld the Affordable Care Act. So presidents of both parties to get more predictable nominees, you can't always predict.
Howard, there's always the exception to the rule, isn't there?
Well, there is, and I would expect going forward that Justice Kagan may prove to be a formidable force on the liberal side. She's a former law school dean at Harvard. She has been the Solicitor General. She's very personable. She could be described as a female John Roberts on the court in terms of her personality and her intellect. And so I think that if more liberal appointees are made in the future, that she could end up being a leader of that side of the court and really make a lot of headway for them.
Do you see any of the appointments that both Clinton and Obama have made? Do you see any of them taking, again, a centrist role when it comes to issues such as affirmative action or voting rights or using the Commerce Clause as a tool of change? You don't see them strutting towards the center now, do you?
Well, not to get overly technical, sometimes Justice Breyer is more towards the center on business issues, but other than that, probably no.
Right, there you go. All right, when we come back, we want to discuss the ages of some of the justices. One age has been already raised in our conversation. And beyond that, we want to take a look at some of the cases that this Supreme Court is going to look at in the next term, and how will that decision change if we have a President Obama or a President Romney in 2013.
It's a huge factor. I think it is one of the things that the president does that has the largest impact, both in the present and the future. People are always worried about, every decision that they make every single day. I'm not sure that the president really controls all that much, but the Supreme Court has, leaves a lasting legacy.
Tonight's American Law Journal has been made possible in part by Scheller PC, a nationally recognized personal injury law firm protecting individuals against dangerous pharmaceutical medicine, including antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, defective products and medical devices, and other personal injury matters. And the Legal Intelligencer, the nation's oldest legal newspaper for lawyers.
The right to an abortion, affirmative action, campaign spending, the barrier between church and state. This presidential election could have a major impact on all of these issues because the next president can have a choice or three as to who steps up next on the Supreme Court. Four guests weigh in tonight. Let me go ahead and reintroduce them. Pammela Saunders is with Drexel University, Earle Mack School of Law, formerly with the U.S. State Department and the Office of the Solicitor General. Howard Bashman is nationally known as an appellate trial attorney, writes for the Legal Intelligencer, and he hosts the popular How Appealing blog with Justice Kagan, apparently occasionally weighing in and saying how good it is. And Professor Tuan Samahon joins us this evening from Villanova University School of Law, where he is a federal courts and constitutional law professor. And Tony Mauro joining us again, 30-plus years award-winning veteran Supreme Court reporter who, if you've read anything about the Supreme Court over the last 3 decades, you've read Tony's work in USA Today, the National Law Journal, or in the Supreme Court Insider. Let's go to Jeffrey Toobin. Again, he was here in Philadelphia recently. Gina Passarella went out on our behalf. She's with the Legal Intelligencer to interview Mr. Toobin. And this is what he said when it came to guessing why John Roberts voted the way he did in the Sebelius case, otherwise known as the Affordable Health Care Act case.
I think also he was concerned about the Supreme Court being seen as a partisan instrument. After Bush v. Gore, after Citizens United, where 5 Republicans dashed Democratic hopes, to do it again in a case of such immense significance, I think was troubling to him.
But when Roberts began to read the opinion, Toobin and many other pundits felt that it was going to go in the direction of the 4 conservative justices. They were going to overturn Obamacare. But Roberts really threw everyone a curveball, even the conservative side of the ledger.
That's what I understand, that the courtroom was shocked when he finally got around to the tax basis for upholding the law, because he did agree with the other conservative justices that the law wasn't valid under the Commerce Clause. So that was a very important aspect of the holding, but it had no consequence for purposes of that case.
Interesting. You know, sometimes, Tony Mauro, we hear in publications that justices will often get to the decision they want to get to, and then they'll back it up. And I know that that's a jaundiced view of our legal process, and probably is upsetting to some of the members of the panel tonight. But let's face it, if Toobin is right, he was fairly determined that the Supreme Court was not going to be looked upon as a partisan tool. Your thoughts?
Oh, I agree. I do think that he had this in mind, that he did not want the Supreme Court to be a political target in the presidential campaign, and it was shaping up that it very well could have if he had joined the majority or joined the other justices to strike down the law. We would be hearing ads and attacks on the Supreme Court. So I think he had that in mind, and I think he did make a conscious effort. I think you're right. There are, both sides of the case had plausible arguments. He could have gone the conservative way and gone against the law, but I think he shifted on this tax argument and decided he had to step up. And of course now he's, by consciously trying to take the court out of politics, he's now being viewed by conservatives as political, that he considered external factors beyond the law of the case in making his decision. So it's kind of a no-win situation, but that's sometimes Chief Justices have to do that in the interest of the integrity of the court.
I think Chief Justice Roberts has institutional duties that the other justices don't have. He's the captain of the ship, and so beyond his individual justices' vote, he is thinking about the institution. That's true. But let's note also that there are lots of things here for conservatives to like, and limited government types. And so in a way, I think he may have stuck it to the administration, and they just don't realize they have a knife in their abdomen.
We only have a few minutes left to go, so let's take a look at what's coming up in this new term. Some cases that are before the court, and some which likely will get before the court. Affirmative action, that particular case has already been argued. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 may come before this court, and either Prop 8 or DOMA. Gay marriage may come before the Supreme Court. If all three of these come before the Supreme Court, I think you'd have to call this a fairly important term, would you not? I know, like those who follow baseball, every year is a great year, every World Series is a great year. But Howard, if those three matters are heard by the Supremes in this term, it's a big year.
Absolutely. And with regard to the affirmative action case, the only thing I can guarantee is that there won't be a ruling before the election. We're not going to know how that's going to come out until after the election.
Right, makes sense. And Tony Mauro, when we talk about gay marriage, tell us why this Supreme Court will probably look at the Defense of Marriage Act aspect of gay marriage and not the Prop 8 matter that came out of California.
I think that's because there has been a well-developed series of decisions already on the Defense of Marriage Act. I think maybe 10 district courts have already ruled, and now as of today, Thursday, we have the 2 appeals courts ruling on the Defense of Marriage Act, and the Second Circuit has ruled that that part of the act that denies benefits to couples, to same-sex couples, federal benefits, is unconstitutional. So I think you have this body of law that has developed in the lower courts, and I think it's ripe for the Supreme Court to take it this term.
Right.
We're just not sure which case or what the timing is.
After the presidential election, we look at some of the justices whose faces and names and ages are up on the screen right now as we're watching. We could see, again, a number of them are in their 70s. Some of them have not been well. We might see 1, 2, perhaps 3 changes over the next 4 years. That would be a major swing either way, Pammela.
It would be, and I think actually that it would be even more of a major swing if Romney were to win the election, because I think the most significant thing here could be that the liberal justices, the ones who were Democratic appointees, are probably the most likely to leave the court in some fashion. And you could really solidify a real conservative majority, not just a 5-4, but really maybe a 6-3 or potentially even more than that. And that, I think, would have an impact for decades to come, more than just, back and forth with different elections.
Tony Mauro, your thoughts about the direction of the court and maybe who might step up if someone does step down or passes away?
Well, I agree that this really is going to be pivotal a few years. Of course, we don't know who's going to depart. They say that there's something in the air or the water at the Supreme Court that makes justices live a very long and healthy time. So we could conceivably have no vacancies, but I think it's unlikely. I think Justice Ginsburg has said she wants to stay on the court until 2014, and not sure beyond that. But there have been some names floated around on both sides that if Mitt Romney is elected, we could have possibly Paul Clement, the former Solicitor General who argued against the Affordable Care Act. He could be a nominee, and then Mike Lee, who's a senator from Utah and a former Supreme Court clerk, could get the nod. As for President Obama, there's a number of fairly young liberal judges on the Ninth Circuit, one who is African American and one who's Vietnamese born. That we've never had an Asian American justice. So I think those are some possibilities, and I think that they will have a significant impact on the court.
So Howard, in this next term, let's say Obama does get reelected, your nightmare comes true, and all of a sudden Obama has 4 more years. Now all of a sudden you could very well see a shift in the court. Here's what the pundits are saying, including Jeffrey Toobin. We haven't seen a conservative replaced by a liberal in a very, very long time. Arguably Ginsburg in the 90s, but she replaced another Democratic nominee. We've seen liberals being replaced by conservatives over the last generation or two. Are we going to see, in Jeffrey Toobin's words, World War III if a conservative passes away, because they're not going to step down in the next 4 years?
Well, I think that it will have a lot to do with what the composition of the Senate is. If 60 Democratic votes are there to overcome a filibuster, then I think that President Obama can get on the court whoever he really wants. If there are
That's not going to happen, Howard.
Right.
Let's face it, okay? So what next?
Well, I think that you're right, that it could be a very long, drawn-out battle that is fought over quite some time.
Can I go on record and predict something? I'm willing to bet the conservatives will fight that a lot harder than the Democrats and progressives fought Samuel Alito. What do you think? I got a smile out of you at least.
I agree.
Yeah. Tony Mauro, your thought?
I do agree that the Republicans are, generally speaking, more committed to getting the court going in their direction than the Democrats. The Democrats aren't as focused on that, and that goes for the president and the Senate. So I think, yes, if we have a strongly liberal nominee put forth by President Obama, it will be a really hard battle, which I think may have the effect of moderating who President Obama picks. It may be more of a moderate, whereas the Republicans tend to go for, all 9 yards and go for a really conservative nominee, and they usually get it.
I want to thank my guest for a compelling conversation tonight. Again, Tony Mauro, joining us from the CNN studios in Washington, D.C. Tony, thank you so much for joining our program, and I do hope we'll see you again sometime in the new term. Let's put it that way, after the election in the new term. Also want to thank Pammela Saunders for joining us today from Drexel University, Earle Mack School of Law, Howard Bashman, nationally renowned appellate trial attorney, and check out his blog, How Appealing, one of the oldest legal blogs on record, and Tuan Samahon with Villanova University School of Law. For all of us here at the American Law Journal, we will see you next week, and until that time, case closed.
The next president will get 1 or 2 Supreme Court nominees. That's how close Roe v. Wade is. Just ask yourself, with Robert Bork being the chief advisor on the court for Mr. Romney, who do you think he's likely to appoint? Do you think he's likely to appoint someone like Scalia or someone else on the court far right that would outlaw abortion? I suspect that would happen. I guarantee you that will not happen.
Tonight's American Law Journal has been made possible in part by Scheller PC, a nationally recognized personal injury law firm protecting individuals against dangerous pharmaceutical medicine, including antidepressants, antipsychotic drugs, defective products and medical devices, and other personal injury matters. And the Legal Intelligencer, the nation's oldest legal newspaper for lawyers.